Thank you very much for that introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak here tonight and to present this research that I have in front of me. There's a fair amount here. I'd say it's about 50% of what I've uncovered. I think it's the most important 50%. So I do hope it'll be of interest to everyone who's here and those who may be watching later. Right, a melting pot, definitely, Claire. That's something I want to add to the melting pot are some Lucky Charms, and that's the image you can see on the right there is the American cereal Lucky Charms, which incidentally arrived in 1964, the same year as this leprechaun invasion, flap or hunt or whatever we choose to call it. And I think that year is obviously a good year for leprechauns. We can see what's going to be ahead of us in the talk. Here, a brief outline. I've put in bold the most important things that have already been identified. I'll start with a brief timeline of the events in Liverpool and the area. Before looking at the historiography about work on these topics, there's a reasonable amount of work specifically on the Liverpool leprechauns, but also material that pertains to the topic. I'll go through some methods and sources, run through those 3 points there that have already been identified, and then roll together some conclusions, or try to. I'll do my best there. So if we're looking for leprechauns, so we're looking at the leprechauns, I think one of the most important things is to establish basics, and these are the basics that you can gather from the press and from many websites and many sources. I apologize for the quality of the photographs there. I did try to get original ones, but these are the ones that were published in the press, and that one is an attempt to convey the bustly nature and the overcrowding around the bowling green in Kensington Park, or Jubilee Park. It goes by a number of names, which adds to our confusion over time. So you can see the first event as such, which starts this all, is supposedly a young boy sees some leprechauns in or on the bowling green in that small park in Kensington, Liverpool. The following day, we have the invasion on that specific spot, which is the most talked about part of this. And following on from that, a few days later, we have a few miles away in Kirkby, a second leprechaun hunt. Now, these are the known ones. These are ones that are recorded in the press and also feature in people's memories. But there is a possibility, and I'll get to this later, of other sightings around this time. However, the evidence for those is far less conclusive. Right, where do we start with historiography? We start with these two gentlemen here who produced the most substantial work hitherto on this subject matter. Nigel Watson, Magonia, you can find online, a great survey of the topic and some very interesting responses to his study on that website. And also more recently, S.D. Tucker, both in his book Paranormal Merseyside and in the Fortean Times, has mentioned and investigated this event, or the events. One of the things that strikes me about both of these studies is that they provide so much food for thought, and I've built on them, and I've also adapted them and tried to relate them to other similar issues and themes. I think Watson, and I'm not going to go through all of their points in detail, but I am going to just highlight them there. And clearly the Irish role and the Irish population of Liverpool appear. Watson also flagged up a similar case in Newcastle around that time in the northeast, and highlighted the press reports about Brian Jones in the 1980s on the top right. Brian lays claim to being the source of the whole thing, and that is a fascinating little area which I won't go into because of course Watson has covered it in detail, and indeed it's been reiterated by Tucker. The UFOs, you can't get away from them in the 1960s, and they feature too, but also there's this understanding of social psychology and the circumstances that comes through from Watson. Tucker, and his incredible contribution, is bringing in Ken Dodd, which, you know, talk about Liverpool, he definitely emerges probably second to the Beatles in many people's estimation. And Ken Dodd himself in 65 laid claim, a bit like Brian Jones really, laid claim to having been the inspiration for the leprechaun hunt. This theme of claiming to be the source is something that returned when I was doing the research and interviewing people or following up and asking questions in Facebook communities. And it's another element of this whole affair that I find fascinating. And Tucker also highlights the behavior of the children in terms of their unruliness, particularly in the first hunt in Kensington, and also draws on a theme identified by Mike Dash about the significance, the folklore of children's hunts. Just to reiterate the significance of leprechauns in the mid 1960s, it wasn't just Ken Dodd with his Diddy Men, which appeared in television towards the later 60s. However, Ken Dodd used his Diddification distortion to shrink somebody on television before the Liverpool leprechaun sighting. So that's the kind of claim and justification. It's pre-Diddy Men in their evolved form, as you can see there, but it's soon after the process of Diddification, which I'm sure, is a world-changing event in itself. But also, a couple of years afterwards, this individual produces a leprechaun-related tune. And so in 1966, we have Rolf Harris with his Leprechauns, but the less said about him, the better. As well as looking at the specific Liverpool context, there's so much about fairies, there's so much about the experiences of people there in Johnson's book. There's the question of children and their experience highlighted there in the Wollets and Gnomes. And there's this association between leprechauns and other elementals and beings with the environment. That is something, again, explored by Jack Hunter and others in that volume. There are so many other issues that overlap with this very particular case study. So I'm going to be very careful not to overload things as can often happen with these topics. So how am I going to approach this, or how have I approached it so far? I've tried to get as many people's memories and testimony as possible. Again, this is not necessarily going to provide factual information, but it will give some idea about the afterlife of this story of the leprechaun invasion. Also, I'm very keen on using the cultural and social context of the time to draw out the meanings and the significance of the event for people at the time. And I'm a great fan of maps to a certain extent. They are very useful in helping us appreciate what was on the ground at the time. And as far as methods go, you can't get away from a close reading and noting what is missing from material, the unspoken, reading between the lines, and also comparing different kind of texts, quite useful. And finally, with a nod again to Jack Hunter, who familiarized me with this terminology, ontological flooding. I don't necessarily believe many of the strangest elements that I'm going to mention, but I do like to put them out there because to provide a more rounded interpretation and of this leprechaun invasion. There's a lot of strange things I'm going to mention today, so I just want to flood those up, identify them before we continue. So I'm letting the doors open, I'm flooding the ideas out, I'm trying not to check them and to dismiss them out of hand. Let's see how it goes. That image on the right, by the way, is of the Liverpool Leprechaun Museum in Dublin, which I think Watson wrote an article about in 40 Times some years ago. Unfortunately, I saw that it's been voted as one of the most boring museums in Ireland. But going from that image, I think it looks absolutely terrifying and may well be worth visiting. I don't know. Well, what are they then? To begin with the three main points. All we kind of know when it comes to a witness statement, a witness testimony, I suppose, as such, is that unnamed 9-year-old boy. And little men, white hats, throwing clods of earth and stones at one another. That is essentially what we have. What can we do with that? He doesn't even call them leprechauns. That doesn't mean that they weren't thought of as leprechauns, but he doesn't use the phrase himself. The press uses it. And I'm not suggesting that the press kind of made people think about leprechauns. There's no doubt that the children themselves are more than capable of drawing those conclusions. But as far as the labeling of the event goes, the press is obviously a very important contributor. And you can't deny the fact that if these little men were wearing white hats, the first thing that comes to my mind are bowlers. But then I had to ask the question, would bowlers have had white hats necessarily when they were on the bowling green at Kensington at the time? It's very hard to get such evidence together, but I suspected not, because my impression of bowling is at competitive level from what I've seen it briefly on television. But I did manage to get this image here. And again, apologies for the quality, but I couldn't get a better one from the press. And it presents us with a scene on the day, on the 1st of July, where you see like a little line of bowlers there, and their hats don't look particularly white. So I'm kind of ruling out bowlers or two angry bowlers as being a cause of what, or being the reason of what the child saw. But you can see in the distance there, it's almost like preparing from a battle. That is the raised area, and we'll see this in the map later, in the park, which covers a reservoir. And the children are lined up there looking over. I think it's a fantastic photograph, as summing up maybe a generational divide, as well as a divide about how public space should be used or could be used. Some question and answers then. Do fairies and leprechauns like to wear white? Because the only item of clothing we see identified there is effectively the white hats. Quite striking, really, because those of you who know your leprechaun history are aware that the red was the most familiar color associated, and that kind of transformed to green, along with a change of hair color, usually attributed to the influence of American culture, the hair color going from white to red. So I had a look into this, and I thought to myself, well, from my own perspective, the only kind of little thing that wears a white hat is a Smurf, as you can see in the top right. And digging into the history of the Smurf, they were around from 1961. Now, this obviously leads to a potential explanation for this. However, they didn't appear on British televisions until the 80s, and that's when I saw them. So it's unlikely that the child, not totally impossible, might have been inspired by the Smurf. Didn't mention any blue skin, however, so I'm not entirely convinced that it was a Smurf. Of course, they were in Belgium from the early 60s. But if you look at folklore, going back to the early 19th century, you can see a reference here by Crocker to fairies in general, rather than leprechauns, having broad white hats like mushrooms. I think it's a fantastic little image there. I'm not suggesting that the 9-year-old boy was aware of this, but it does bring some potential similarities to light. I'm aware of other fairies, some in Wales as well, having a preference for white. But this is a bit more potential connection there in terms of hairstyle. Now, the throwing of stones and rocks is something which, and clods of earth, is something which again is quite familiar in folklore, particularly in the Highlands of Scotland where it's recorded. And it's going on here as well in the park. It's going on between the two leprechauns at the beginning, but it also seems to spill over on the following day. Apologies for the rather cheap joke there, but these entities like to throw things. And again, the leprechaun, despite its trickster characteristics, is, I couldn't find particularly, maybe somebody knows more precisely, that they may be more keen on throwing stones than I've found so far. But when it comes to strange things, then they may well throw stones. We think about poltergeists and we think of other kind of entities like that. We know aware of the cluricorn as well, which is kind of like the barred leprechaun, which has evolved and over time. Nonetheless, the original leprechaun was always a bit naughty and trickster, one way or the other. But stone throwing doesn't seem to have been a particular talent or aptitude possessed. But this throwing of stones features the day after the young boy is meant to have seen it. And indeed, those of you familiar with this, who may the other accounts, recount the park policeman, not a park warden, it was a park police in Liverpool until 1972, wearing a crash helmet during this occasion, during the evening and into the night, because of his supposedly being hit on the head with stones. And the police, and this is another thing that isn't often recognised, have set up a first aid post there where a number of children, like a dozen or so, were treated for minor grazes and injuries. Something peculiar is going on. And to be honest, I'm not entirely sure the children were doing this. I mean, Tucker assumes, and I think he's quite right to assume, because who else would be throwing these things? But there's nothing specifically in the reports that identify, as far as I can see, the children throwing stones. Given the context of the time, which we'll come to, I think any children throwing stones would have been roundly condemned and criticised. Um, it's a bit of an opening there that has got room for some ontological flooding. Was Nolan being targeted by some kind of entities? I don't know, but it's definitely more open than I initially thought from when I've read these accounts. Perhaps they're both throwing stones, the children and something else. The big part of what I've been looking into, however, regards the hunt. Obviously, what the entities were is very much open to speculation. I've suggested things from Smurfs to poltergeists there, and of course, leprechauns figure quite prominently. But as for the inspiration, and this is where I follow a similar path to Tucker with Ken Dodd, but I don't follow the deification thesis. Instead, I start looking at some TV schedules. And it's surprising. People who've studied UFO phenomenon have always turned their attention to film and television. And I thought, well, let's do it with the Liverpool Leprechauns and see what we find. And I found quite a bit, and I'll just run you through some of the pros and cons of these different potential explanations. So, on the left, some of you may well be familiar with this very popular television series. We can see Bonanza and Hoss and the Leprechaun episode. Now, this was a very popular television program at the time. Moreover, it was something which was fairly early on in the evening. So when you think about it, it was a popular show and it was screened 8 p.m. on a Friday. The cons in that explanation, however, are that it was screened on the 7th of February in Liverpool on televisions. So there's quite a gap in time between it and the actual events. Now, we can't dismiss this and the role in the imaginations of children, and not so much watching it, because of course they wouldn't have been watching it on a video recorder or anything, or it wouldn't have been replayed for some time. However, the show being talked about is something that we can't dismiss. But that length of time does make me lean a little bit away from placing too much emphasis on Bonanza. There's also the cinema, and this very famous, at the time, 1959 movie, Darby O'Gill and the Little People. It was screened in cinemas around the area in the early 60s. It was a 1959 film, as I said. Again, earlier in the decade, so not even the same year necessarily. It doesn't seem as likely. I kind of put most of my I put most of my money on the example on the right, which unfortunately I couldn't find a very good image for, even though you can find a little bit online about this particular episode. It's called The Leprechaun, unsurprisingly, and it's from 1955, so it goes back quite far. And it was screened as part of the Douglas Fairbanks Jr. Present series. It's a very intriguing little series, this is, of some very peculiar and strange stories. The Leprechaun one, which I found a synopsis of online, it seems a bit eerie. It didn't actually, doesn't seem very cheery. It definitely seems a bit, has kind of mysterious and suspicious elements to it and strange things. That was screened on the 25th of June on Liverpool televisions. So that's fairly close to the first sighting at the end of that month. Now, that doesn't mean that it's automatically a cause, but it does provide a potential reason. The cons, however, and this is quite important, is that it was screened at 11 p.m. on a Thursday night. So it's not even a school night, like the Bonanza episode was at least on a Friday. So it is a school night, rather. And in 1964, the Television Act had introduced the watershed at 9 p.m. Now, I don't think everybody sticks to the watershed. I didn't as a child necessarily. My parents didn't enforce it. Then, of course, I could have a TV in my room back then, if you're fortunate enough. So the time of day, the day it's screened, can it really have that much influence? Well, let's think of word of mouth. Undoubtedly, if this show was talked about by older siblings, by parents and others, it may well have settled in the children's imaginations to some extent, who were younger and may not have seen it. I certainly remember the influence of television programs that I wasn't allowed to see off movies. They could often be quite significant. But there's more to this. And it again relates a lot to the TV schedules. Take a look at that on the left. The day of two channels. BBC Two had arrived in 1964, but it wouldn't reach the north until the end of 65. So you were stuck with two channels. But to be fair, the variety of material here is, well, thought-provoking. I'm not going to be brave and use some annotation options here, but I'll just move my cursor. You can see at just past 11 o'clock, the leprechaun is there. It's a very short, half an hour length drama. But if you go back to 20 to 10, the Outer Limits episode is on. Now that Outer Limits episode is the same one that's credited or thought to have influenced Barney Hill's experience of alien abduction. So it's got history, basically, and that's the image on the right. The combination of these two programs and how they might have been conflated and brought together, I think, makes the television hypothesis all the more convincing, if not entirely accurate, or well, we can't prove it in any other sense, it's just circumstantial. But nonetheless, I think this is important. I think it's a very important point indeed, because unlike Ken Dodd's claims, there's no claim here. It is simply what was in the cultural atmosphere at the time. So the Bolero Shield episode provided some overlap and conflation. And indeed, the UFO sightings that were happening, I mean, there were reported sightings in Crosby on the 17th of July, and there were some fake UFOs being discovered over the other side of the Mersey in Wirral Peninsula at this time too. Allowed the newspapers themselves and some of the children in Kirkby to create a combination of little green men and little green men. Although, of course, we do know that leprechauns generally were wearing red for much of their history. And there's another strange explanation I'd like to bring. Another why. And this is a bit more ontological flooding, but not in the sense of letting in the supernatural, but as letting in an individual who may well have played a part in this. Maybe not individually or personally, but that is still a possibility. Paul Goldin, originally a medical student, and then turned his attention to hypnotism, parapsychological. Sometimes he shied away from the term hypnotism himself, but his career is fascinating. It is an example of how there were opportunities from working men's clubs in the north of England, but he particularly plied his trade, and I don't mean that in a derogative way, but in Ireland. And you can guess where I'm going with this, can't you? Because as a hypnotist, you often like people to see things that aren't there, get them to do things that are nothing to do with their environment, but something that's put into their minds. I've never been hypnotized myself. I can't speak for the experience of being hypnotized. So I'm reading the accounts of Goldin's shows, and, well, one of his most notorious shows, or parts of his show, was making people see leprechauns. Now, anybody who can make people see leprechauns and get them to go looking for leprechauns, because that is one of the particular features of his act, is going to draw attention. His leprechaun hunts in Cork and Dublin also took place in England. In April of 1964, they happened in Brighton. People describing, I think it was a group of 4 men running down the street looking for leprechauns. Kind of like a normal thing sometimes, not a particularly normal thing to see in Brighton, but Goldin had made people think there were leprechauns around. And of course, catching a leprechaun allows you to gain wealth, and all those themes that are associated with leprechauns play into this. with his role in Ireland, there's no doubt that Golding would have been travelling to and fro across the Irish Sea on numerous occasions. After his escapades in Brighton in April, Southern Television just decided to interview him rather than allow him to perform any acts on anybody because it was deemed potentially disturbing or invasive, or for whatever reason, he was just had a chat with the hosts on the television program. So there's two possibilities from this that help us explain the hunt. Another outside shot, I must admit, but still something that might be worth thinking about. One, the more extreme reason, is that Golding's travels to and fro may well have led to him indulging in a bit of off-the-cuff hypnosis practice in the streets of Liverpool. The second, slightly more convincing, is that these escapades that he took part in, particularly those in April of 1964, and I would like to know exactly what his movements were between April and the end of June, whether he went to any working men's clubs in the north or where he did perform some of his acts, could have filtered through to the children, and the adults may have talked about it, thus providing another potential reason for the leprechauns to emerge. There's lots to think about here. And when we get to the maps, there's even more that helps explain what's going on. I've chosen two maps from the 1960s. They're very useful because even though the land really hasn't changed much, obviously, the institutions and the buildings that are around the areas have. And again, I'm steering away from using tools to highlight things. I'm just using my cursor here. I don't know if anybody can see that, but you can roughly see at the bottom of the Kensington Gardens area there in the middle of the map. And this is about 1.5 miles from Liverpool. You can see the University of Liverpool there to the side. You can see the bowling green at the bottom of that area. And it is there, of course, where the 9-year-old reportedly saw what was going on. Above it, we see the Kensington Reservoir, which is covered over. That's where those children were lined up in that photograph a few slides ago. Now, I've had a talk with a man who was a policeman in that area, not part of the park police, but he became a policeman just not long after this had happened. And he said one of the constant pains was chasing children off that reservoir, the covered reservoir, for their own safety. And that's one of the roles of the park police and also the police was doing that. I've also heard from another individual that they used to love playing cricket and football up there on the reservoir too. So yeah, as you'd imagine, it's a very popular place to play, being so high up as well. You see the schools. There are a number of schools nearby. There's one to the left there, but more immediately, there's some just to the bottom right, not just the one there, but right next to the park itself. Note the police station. There's a small police station on the road to the south of the park. And the two busy roads run either side, roughly, of the park. So I'll give you an idea of the urban context there. When the crowds of children headed over there on the 1st of July, then the roads became congested and it became a problem. And it became a practical problem in terms of crowd management and control and so forth. And the ages of the children are meant to range from tiny tots, to quote the press, whatever that means. I suppose it means young, to 14 years old. And I often find it interesting that they use that cutoff point of 14. And once again, I'm trying not to take us down too many alleyways here, but the school leaving age at this time was 15. So I think maybe that's seen as a cutoff point in some people's eyes, maybe childhood, maturity, and so forth. Let's do a bit of ontological flooding. Let's go ahead and do another bit. Leprechauns, originally, according to some, are water spirits. Now, that's something they're definitely well established in the land by Victorian times, if not earlier. But that reservoir there, and I know some investigators do place emphasis on the role of water and in strange phenomena, that covered reservoir makes me think, yes, maybe. Let's just play with that possibility for a while. But irrespective of its supernatural event, it played a signaled role in this event, as allowing students a vantage point from which to survey the area and to look for the leprechauns. You can see behind or to the just above the reservoir there, the playground. You kind of get the idea from that, the children's place in this space. And with these events, the children tended to spill over into places that maybe they shouldn't be, or at least they shouldn't be in such numbers or with such obvious intent. So that's location number one for a leprechaun hunt. Well, densely old buildings, not really in the centre of Liverpool, but effectively very nearby. You can see the rows of houses and the streets. It would have been quite easy for children to make their way there. Nonetheless, having to traverse some very busy roads. It's the second hunt that often gains most attention. And in my questions that I've placed on Facebook and to look for groups into this, it's Kirkby that's provided most answers. I've found less information despite a couple of interviews regarding Kensington. Kirkby definitely seems like a second and perhaps even more extensive example of a hunt. And this is about 6 miles as the crow flies from Liverpool, a bit longer if you're traveling by road. There's a wider area here, significantly wider. And the sightings are supposedly based on St. Chad's Church, but also in the Catholic church there and the schools nearby. Now, as you can see, there are schools right in the centre there too. The Old Rough area, which is something I didn't really appreciate until I began listening to people's memories and also looking at the map, is obviously something that would attract a child's imagination. A wooded area in the middle of a built-up area, somewhere to explore. And the same is true, I suppose, over by St. Chad's Church, which features most prominently in the newspaper accounts. We even get some in the People newspaper, a national paper, some comments from minister there talking about what a headache it's been on the Friday and the Saturday in particular to try to get the children out of that. Again, a wooded area around the vicarage, and once again, quite a busy road there, it's a large roundabout and so forth. Great concentration around that area, but also elsewhere over here. What can we make of this second example? Well, it lasted slightly longer. It definitely gained more press attention. Reading some of the reports closely, there are accounts that suggest that children didn't return home and it caused concern for parents. And they were discovered hanging around St. Chad's Church in particular. Some people have suggested that they saw leprechauns on the church tower or on the church roof. These are later recollections. Others mention the search, the digging, the looking for things, the pulling up of plants, which of course is quite relevant, with leprechaun law, that the treasure is often hidden under a specific plant or a weed, even a flower. The response to this issue is something that I've really enjoyed looking at. It allows us to try and build a picture based on the adult perspective, because frequently we talk about the children and what they did. But most of these and what the sources that we have are from adult eyes. And undoubtedly, safety was a considerable concern for the police and for some family members, not only with that reservoir in Kensington Park, but with the roads in Kirkby too. I think we can learn a lot as well from looking at things like population. we understand, we know that there was a baby boom after the Second World War and increasing numbers of young people, and that can make a difference to, obviously, you know, the world around you, the sounds you hear, the activities. And as we have an aging population now, likewise, we can speculate about how different it would be to have a larger number of children and young people. And indeed, the summer of 1964 saw about 8,000 children leaving schools in the area, and some concern about how they would fit into the workplace. And that's an illustration of the place, emphasis placed then on young people in these times. Now, that is associated with concern about behavior. The mods and rockers were round and about. In May 1964 onwards, we have their fights, and particularly on the seaside resorts in the south of England. Very well known, very well publicized, often referred to as one of the first media moral panics. The average age of those engaged in those, well, the ones brought to court, was 17. So we're talking about a group slightly older than those tots to 14-year-olds. But nonetheless, for many adults, this was part of a youth problem. And it wasn't just mods and rockers. In some ways, those tribes are easily identifiable. It was more the random vandalism, referred to as a teen problem, words like delinquency, hooliganism, that was very much in the air. And with more children, then clearly it's not particularly because they're young, but more likely to be involved in some misdemeanors and the like. This led to some very strong language being uttered. And this is not the vicar who was in St. Charles, by the way, but his reference to the scum. He was using it metaphorically, but I do think it's still quite strong language for anybody, a vicar or otherwise, referring to these problem children and problem youngsters. And this amounts to something quite substantial. It's based on criminal events like this. A church being vandalized is clearly something that is very symbolic. There were also rocks being put or stones being put on railways and the like. And these are similar concerns expressed in America too. So we're getting a lot of conversations about bad behavior in the press. And you can see how this could relate, I suppose, to what was going on as children tore up plants or wandered into areas that they shouldn't, behaved in ways that are a little bit unnerving or unusual. On the other hand, I think we can also see another type of adult perspective on what was going on. That this childish escapade, for all of its dangers and inconveniences, was something magical. The concern about children growing up too fast, and we no need to mention this, but Beatlemania is more than prominent in the culture of the time, led to some solace, I suppose, for those who thought, oh well, they're looking for leprechauns. And perhaps some adults made a lot of this and felt perhaps reassured to some extent about this display of childish innocence that was happening all around them, and definitely with reference to the press. So I'd like to spend quite a while talking about, in conclusion here, in the final 10 minutes, to take up to 50 minutes or so of reflection on leprechauns to leave plenty of time for questions. It leaves a mark, and what I've called leprechaun afterlives, I suppose, summarizes this. There's a literary inspiration, the book there on the right. The author himself has said that he was inspired in part by what he'd heard about with the leprechaun invasion. Even though the character became a dwarf in the book, nonetheless, it was part inspired by that. There was a football team during the 1980s known as the Leprechauns, an employed seven-a-side team. Again, I don't know why or how that name came to be, but it may well have some part to do with it. And when you read about the traditions and the testimonies online in various blogs and comments, and also the work of people like Janet Board and Tom Sleeman's comments as well, descriptions of this, there's a possibility that sightings took place elsewhere. I just want to go back a few slides to the Kensington slide, and you may be able to see it there. But again, that's in the way for me. But you can see in the right-hand corner the Botanic Gardens of that image, which, yes, there we have them there, so I can see them. And there were other areas and green spaces in Liverpool that were reportedly visited by strange little beings of one variety or other. So I think there's a potential here for maybe digging down and looking into more examples of the phenomena elsewhere. Also, another thing that comes out are additional claims. These aren't the claims of Brian Jones or of Jones or of Ken Dodd, but individuals who contact me by saying, "Oh, it was my uncle who was the 9-year-old boy," or "My friend started this rumor." And even though I think many of these are clearly wishful thinking or playfulness, as you'd expect, maybe the leprechauns themselves are involved in some of these claims, I think they're valuable because they help us understand the ways in which these stories grow and they spread out in certain directions. There's one individual who suggested that Liverpudlian people made it up because they like a laugh and they like tricking people about these things. Now, clearly, I don't think that is a feasible explanation as such, but I do think it's a very useful example of how such events can be associated with the city as a whole and supposed character of its inhabitants. So those claims I file under interesting. For that purpose, the development of a folklore, you could imagine, or urban legend about the leprechauns. Now, I haven't suggested that a statue be placed in the Kensington Gardens or Jubilee Park, as it was known as. Those of you who know that there's a Peter Pan statue at Kensington Palace Gardens in London can see perhaps where I'm coming from with this. Maybe deserve a leprechaun statue there, if anything, to try to have our own equivalent of Mothman statues or the like in the area. But so far, no one suggested that. It hasn't come about. Maybe one day there'll be a leprechaun there. It would definitely help people appreciate the significance of this, because this conclusion is very much making a case for the significance of the Liverpool leprechaun invasion, brief invasion of the summer of 1964. Leaving aside the possibility of leprechauns or just a fiction or something else, it does matter with one question, but maybe not with others. Because what makes this stand out as an occasion is that something which fairy sightings may well be reported on an individual basis or maybe part of a personal belief or an interest. But what happens in 64 is that it enters the public realm prominently. It becomes a social issue for the police and those who set up the first aid camp in Kensington, or those who are trying to corral the children away from St. Chad's Church in Kirkby. But it also becomes something which people read about and talk about. And I really do wish, and this is always the frustration for anybody trying to examine the past, I knew what people were talking about when this was happening and when they were reading about it and what their opinions were, as well as their experiences. We are limited in terms of the sources we have. It enables us to make some assessments of what's going on. So it's a public example of this. And it's very unfortunate that, unlike the Willerton example, that we don't have, children weren't asked to draw pictures, or the original 9-year-old wasn't asked to draw any image of, and so forth. It really is unfortunate, but still, we have the traces of the hunts to follow. We're hunting the hunters here, really, to some extent. And before I forget, I may should have said this earlier, this idea of hunting for leprechauns doesn't seem to have been everyone's experience. A couple of individuals I've heard said they were frightened and a bit unnerved, and these are from Kirkby, about something living in the old rough, and tried to walk down the middle of the road just in case the leprechauns would leap out from the hedges. My previous comments about road safety are clearly of relevance here. It's even more significant because to understand the leprechaun invasion, we need to understand quite a bit about the 1960s, as Watson has argued. The way in which many of these children's siblings would have been acting and what they would have been doing would have played a part, perhaps, in their own desires for entertainment and excitement, and may well have crafted their own because of their limitations in what they could do, unlike children who were just like a year or two older. There's also this idea of what youth was and what young people were, and how they might behave and how some of their behavior might be feared. And the leprechaun case could support the negative interpretation of the young as well as the positive one. I think it's particularly interesting that it is at this time when the leprechaun's image is being, you could say, refined and stripped of some of its more tricksterish or problematic features. This is the time of, in the USA anyway, Lucky Charms. The image of the leprechaun is becoming less, you could argue, problematic, more refined for entertainment. And this is something which, of course, is said about fairies in general. The Disneyfication is often the term used. It's funny, at this time, we do have this blip or an expression of perhaps a more problematic leprechaun spirit at work. Maybe it was the last response, even though that's a bit premature given those leprechaun movies, but nonetheless, we definitely see here a leprechaun idea of the leprechaun that is a little less perhaps Americanized. Again, that's a question that could be explored in more detail later. Liverpool leprechauns, American versions or not, to discuss. So the whole affair leaves a lot of space for wonder and speculation. It's far from over. I've mined sources, thought about potential reasons, just like previous investigators have. I'm not saying anything that I've said tonight with any certainty. I'm a Fortean through and through in that respect. I just like to put them out there and speculate about potential explanations, ranging from the mundane to the more significant. So I'll leave you with that haunting image of a leprechaun shedding light on themselves. And perhaps indeed, that's what we'll have to do. We can only rely on the leprechauns to reveal themselves. But what we've looked at tonight reveals a lot about the people, the times, and the context in which the Liverpool leprechaun invasion took place. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was a fascinating talk. Yeah, I think we've had lots and lots of comments here and questions. So Christian will be getting into those with you in a moment, get into the nitty gritty. But I really, really thoroughly enjoyed that, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you back to cover some more of the topics you emailed to me as well. So if anybody does have any extra questions or anything additional from the chat, Christian's going to take over now. I'm going to have to duck out, I'm afraid. But next week we will see you for another webinar with this time.